Alara felt the valley's judgment as a physical weight, a pressure in the air colder than the wind that scraped down the granite shoulders of the mountains. It had been a year since Liam's passing, a year since the silence in their small rented cottage in the town had grown too loud to bear. The town, nestled in the crease of the valley, had offered its condolences in the form of pitying glances and baskets of dry bread, gestures that felt more like offerings to the unfortunate than genuine comfort. They saw her as a loose thread in their tightly woven community, a woman unmoored, a problem waiting to happen. And now she had proven them right. With the last of Liam's meager savings after the debts were paid and the landlord had taken his due, she had done the unthinkable. She had purchased the one property no one wanted, the skeletal remains of a cabin clinging to a windswept bluff overlooking the river, a place universally known as Liam's Folly. It was a structure built of hope and naivete, two materials that stood no chance against the valley's winters. Liam had started it years ago, dreaming of a life away from the town's suffocating propriety. He had felled the timber himself, squared the logs with an old adze, and raised the walls with more enthusiasm than skill. But the land was poor, a thin blanket of soil over a bed of rock, and the wind was a constant, malevolent presence. He had never finished it. The roof was a patchwork of salvaged slate and tar paper. The window openings were covered with greased hides that glowed a sickly yellow in the daylight, and the door was a heavy, ill-fitting plank that argued with the frame every time it was moved. The community saw it not as a home, but as a monument to a dead man's foolish dream, and now the living folly of his widow. Her acquisition of the property was the talk of the town for a week. Silas Croft, the lumber merchant whose ledgers held the debts of half the valley, had laughed openly in the general store. He was a man built of solid, profitable timber, with a face that looked as though it had been planned into a permanent expression of shrewd disapproval. He had wanted the land, not for the cabin which he'd have burned, but for the timber rights on the far side of the bluff, which Liam had foolishly included in the original deed. Croft had assumed Alara would abandon it, that he could pick it up for pennies in a tax sale. Her purchase was an affront to his sense of order. "That woman's buying her own tombstone," he declared to the men gathered around the stove. "She'll be frozen solid by the first snow. A mercy, some might say." The whispers followed her like her own shadow. They called her the widow of the perch, a flightless bird waiting for a storm to sweep her away. Thomas, their nearest neighbor a full mile down the slope, was kinder, but his kindness was steeped in a weary pity that was almost worse than Croft's scorn. He was a farmer whose reality was etched into the lines of his face, a man who understood the brutal arithmetic of the land. He had known Liam, had warned him about the wind, about the shallow soil. He came to see her the day after she moved her few belongings: a cot, a small table, a trunk of linens, and a cast-iron stove, into the derelict cabin. He stood in the doorway, his large frame blocking the light, his hat in his hands. "Alara," he said, his voice a low rumble, "this is no place for you. The wind, it has teeth up here. The cold will come right through these logs." He gestured to the walls, where daylight was visible in the chinks between the timbers. "Liam, he was a good man, but he was a dreamer. This place is a dream, not a house." "It's all I have, Thomas," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. She was packing mud and moss into the largest of the gaps, her hands already raw. "It's mine." He sighed, a sound of profound resignation. "Let me bring you some proper insulation. I've got wool shoddy, some spare lumber. We could board up the inside, make it tighter." She shook her head, a gesture so small he almost missed it. "Thank you, Thomas, but I have a plan." He saw the look in her eyes then, a glint of something that wasn't despair. It was a focused, almost unnerving determination. He didn't understand it, and it made him uneasy. He left her with a sack of potatoes and a heart heavy with foreboding. telling himself he'd be back to retrieve her body before the winter solstice. Ilara's plan had not been born of logic or engineering, but of grief and observation. In the first few weeks, when the loneliness was a physical ache, she had spent her days by the river that flowed at the base of the bluff. It was a fast, cold river, born from high mountain snowmelt. Its bed was a mosaic of stones, smoothed and rounded by millennia of tumbling. One afternoon, sitting on the bank as the autumn sun began to lose its strength, she trailed her hand in the water. It was icy cold, but when she pulled her hand out and rested it on a large, flat stone on the bank, a stone that had been basking in the sun all day, she felt a deep, penetrating warmth. It was a living heat, a stored memory of the sun. She kept her hand there as the shadows lengthened and the air grew crisp, and the stone remained warm long after the light had faded from the sky. That night, huddled by her small stove, the wind shrieking through the walls, she remembered a story her grandmother used to tell. It was an old tale from a time before sawmills and iron nails, about the first people who settled these mountains. They didn't fight the cold, her grandmother had said. They invited it in and taught it to be warm. They built their homes with a stone heart, a great hearth and chimney in the center that soaked up the fire's heat and held it through the longest, darkest nights. The memory, faint at first, began to coalesce into an idea so contrary to common sense that it felt like a form of madness. Conventional wisdom held that stone was cold. It was what you built cellars out of, a material that leached warmth from a room. To insulate, you used air, trapped in wool, in sawdust, in moss. You built with wood, which felt warmer to the touch. Thomas's offer of wool and boards was the sensible path. But Ilara's mind was fixed on the river stone, on that deep, patient warmth. What if the problem wasn't the stone itself, but how it was used? What if, instead of a single hearth, the entire house became the hearth? What if she didn't just chink the logs, but lined the entire interior of the cabin with a second wall, a wall of river stone? The thought was audacious. It was absurd. The labor would be monumental. But the image of that sun-warmed stone became an obsession. It was a different kind of wisdom, not the practical ledger book knowledge of men like Croft, but something older, something that listened to the earth itself. The cabin was Liam's folly. This would be hers. The work began the next day. She owned a rusty wheelbarrow with a wobbly wheel, a relic left with the cabin. Her first journey down the steep path to the river felt like a pilgrimage. The air was cool, smelling of pine and damp earth. At the river's edge, she was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of her task. There were millions of stones. She needed thousands. She started not with a plan, but with a feeling. She looked for stones that were flat on at least one side, stones the size of a loaf of bread, some smaller, like fists. She ignored their color and focused on their shape and heft. Each one felt like a promise. The first wheelbarrow load was a lesson in humility. The path back up the bluff was steep and treacherous. The single wheel caught on roots and rocks, and the weight of the stones threatened to tip the barrow at every step. Her arms burned, her back screamed in protest, and sweat stung her eyes. By the time she reached the cabin, gasping for breath, she had managed to transport perhaps 30 stones. It was a pathetic mound against the vast emptiness of the cabin wall. She looked at the small pile, then at the immense task ahead, and for a moment the scorn of the town felt like truth. This was impossible. But then she picked up one of the stones. It was cool and smooth in her hands. She thought of Liam's hopeful, calloused hands building these walls. She thought of her grandmother's stories. She was not just building a wall, she was building a shield. She would not be driven out by the cold or by contempt. Her grief, which had been a hollow ache, began to harden into resolve. Each stone she lifted was a small victory against despair. Her days fell into a grueling rhythm. Dawn brought the aching journey down to the river. The morning was spent selecting and loading stones, her world shrinking to the clatter of rock on rock, the cold shock of the river water on her ankles. The afternoon was consumed by the Herculean effort of pushing the wheelbarrow up the bluff, often taking 3 or 4 rests. The evenings by the light of a tallow lamp were for the second part of her plan, the mortar. She had no money for lime. Instead, she dug clay from a deposit she found near the riverbank, mixing it with sand and dried grasses from the meadow, adding water until it had the consistency of thick porridge. It was a primitive, ancient recipe, one she had to perfect through trial and error. Her first few batches dried too quickly and cracked. The next were too wet and slumped. But slowly she learned the right proportions, the feel of the mud in her hands. She began on the north wall, the one that bore the brunt of the winter wind. She laid a foundation of the largest, flattest stones, then began building upwards, leaving a gap of a few inches between the log wall and her new stone one. She slathered her clay mortar onto each stone, pressing it firmly against its neighbors, filling every gap. It was slow, meticulous work. Each stone had to be chosen to fit the space left by the one before it, a 3-dimensional puzzle with an infinite number of pieces. Her hands became a map of her labor, crisscrossed with cuts and scrapes, her fingernails broken, her skin permanently stained by the gray clay. The community watched her strange, relentless activity with a mixture of amusement and alarm. Riders on the main road would stop and stare up at the bluff, watching her small figure wrestling with the wheelbarrow. The story of her project spread, embellished with each telling. She was building a fortress. She was mad with grief. Silas Croft, hearing of her efforts, made a special trip up the path. He found her inside the cabin, standing on a small stool, her face smudged with clay, wrestling a heavy stone into place. The north wall was nearly halfway done, a solid, mottled gray surface that seemed to drink the light. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth. Croft didn't bother to knock. He stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. "So the stories are true," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're turning this shack into a cave. Do you plan to hibernate like a bear, madam?" Alara didn't turn around. She carefully set the stone, tapping it into place, scraping away the excess mortar with a shard of wood. "I'm making it warm, Mr. Croft." He laughed, a sharp, barking sound. "Warm? With stone? My dear woman, have you lost your senses entirely? Stone is a thief of heat. My root cellar is lined with stone, and it stays cold enough to keep apples fresh through June. You are building a refrigerator around yourself. You are cementing your own coffin. The earth remembers the sun," she said, more to herself than to him. She turned to face him then, her eyes clear and steady. There was no fear in them, only a weariness that had no time for his brand of cruelty. "And so do these stones." Her strange, quiet certainty seemed to unnerve him more than any argument would have. He scoffed, shaking his head. "This is a greater folly than your husband ever dreamed of. I'll make you an offer, one last time out of Christian charity. $5 for the deed. I'll even send my men to help you move your things back to town before you kill yourself with this madness." "The cabin is not for sale," she said, and turned back to her wall. His face darkened. The veneer of charity vanished, revealing the raw greed beneath. "Then freeze," he snarled, and stormed away, his boots thudding down the path. His visit, meant to intimidate her, had the opposite effect. It was fuel. His scorn was a wind at her back, pushing her forward. Autumn deepened. The aspen groves on the lower slopes turned a brilliant, trembling gold, then shed their leaves like a shower of coins. The air grew a sharper edge. Ilara worked with a desperate urgency. The north wall was finished, a solid, seamless barrier of stone and clay from floor to ceiling. She started on the west wall, the direction of the prevailing storms. The work was no easier, but her body had hardened to it. Her muscles, once screaming in protest, were now corded and strong. She could judge the weight of a stone by sight, could flip it onto the wheelbarrow with a practiced economy of motion. Thomas visited again, this time with a quarter of a cured ham and a worried frown. He saw the progress she had made and simply stood there, shaking his head slowly. The interior of the cabin was shrinking, becoming more cave-like, just as Croft had said. The new stone walls were dark and imposing. "Ilara, the first hard frost is coming," he said gently. All this rock, it's going to hold the cold. Once it gets chilled, it'll take a week of steady fire just to take the edge off. It's not too late. Let me help you board it up right." "The fire won't be for the air, Thomas," she explained, her patience as solid as the wall she was building. "It'll be for the stones. I'm not heating the room. I'm heating the walls." He stared at her as if she were speaking a foreign language. He had lived in this valley his entire life. He knew how to survive its winters. You built a big fire, you huddled close, and you stuffed every crack to keep the heat from escaping. Her idea was backward. It was insane. He laid the ham on her small table, his heart aching for her. He saw not a determined innovator, but a woman so broken by grief she had retreated into a world of nonsensical labor. He left without another word, convinced he was leaving a woman to her fate. By the time the first snowflakes drifted down from a sky the color of old pewter, 3 of the 4 walls were complete. The cabin was now a room within a room. The original log walls formed the outer shell. Inside, separated by a small air gap, was her fortress of stone. The space was smaller, darker, the light from the hide-covered windows seeming to be swallowed by the rock. But it was also profoundly still. When she closed the heavy door, the constant moan of the wind was muffled to a distant whisper. The silence was no longer empty. It felt solid, watchful. She had left the last wall, the one with the door and her small stove, for a reason. Her plan required one final, crucial element. The stovepipe went straight up through the roof, wasting most of its heat. With Thomas's unwitting help, he had left a few lengths of stovepipe behind on a previous visit. Hoping she might see reason, she reconfigured it. She directed the pipe out the back of the stove and ran it through the air gap between the log wall and her new stone one, a long, winding metal serpent that would carry the hot smoke along the length of the north and west walls before exiting through the roof. The metal would heat the air in the gap, and more importantly, it would directly heat the stones from behind. The walls themselves would become a giant, slow-release radiator. The first fire she lit in the reconfigured stove was a moment of terrifying truth. She fed small pieces of seasoned pine into its belly and watched the smoke draw. She ran her hand along the stone wall near the stove. Nothing. For an hour she fed the fire, a knot of fear tightening in her stomach. Had Croft and Thomas been right? Was this all a massive, tragic miscalculation? Then she felt it. A subtle, creeping change. The stone directly behind the stove was no longer cold to the touch. It was not warm, not yet, but the icy chill was gone. She moved her hand further down the wall, tracing the path of the hidden pipe. There, too, the change was happening. A slow, deep, almost imperceptible absorption of energy. She kept the fire going all day, a steady, moderate burn. By nightfall, the entire surface of the 2 connected walls was radiating a gentle, uniform warmth. It was nothing like the fierce, direct heat of the stove itself. It was a soft, ambient heat, like that of the sun-warmed stone by the river. It filled the small space not with scorching air, but with a profound sense of thermal stability. She let the fire die down to embers and went to her cot. In the past, the cabin would have become instantly, dangerously cold. Tonight the stones held their warmth, a silent, stony guardian against the encroaching night. The cold could press against the logs outside, but it could not reach her. She slept more soundly than she had in a year. Winter arrived not as a guest, but as an invading army. The snows came, deep and frequent, burying the valley in a blanket of white. The wind was a constant torment, sculpting the drifts into fantastic, menacing shapes. For the townsfolk and the farmers, it was a season of struggle, of endless chopping wood and huddling by fires that seemed to fight a losing battle against the cold that seeped through every crack and pane of glass. In her stone-lined cabin, Ilara lived in a different world. Her days were calm and methodical. She needed far less wood than her neighbors, for her fire was not for survival, but for storage. A few hours of a moderate fire in the morning and a few in the evening were enough to charge the great stone walls with heat that lasted through the day and night. The temperature inside her cabin barely fluctuated. It was a steady, comfortable warmth that felt ancient and secure. She had enough food stored, and when the weather permitted, she would trek out on snowshoes to check her snares. She was not just surviving, she was comfortable. She was at peace. Section. The mockery from the town had faded, replaced by a grudging silence. They saw smoke from her chimney and assumed she was managing for now. No one bothered to make the trip up to the folly. They were too busy with their own battles against the cold. But the real test was yet to come. It began in late January with a change in the light. The sky took on a pale, crystalline quality, and the sun, when it appeared, seemed distant and powerless. The old-timers called it the white silence, a rare and dreaded phenomenon where a mass of Arctic air would descend from the high peaks and settle in the valley like a shroud. It was a dry, still cold, a cold that didn't bluster, but sank deep into the bones of the world. The temperature plummeted. It dropped past 0, then 10 below, then 20. The very air seemed to crackle. Trees exploded as their sap froze, the sound ringing through the unnerving silence like rifle shots. It was a cold that killed. In the town, people stayed indoors, burning through their wood piles at an alarming rate. Even in the best-built houses, frost formed on the inside of the walls. Livestock in the barns began to die, frozen in their stalls. Silas Croft's large, well-appointed house, with its big glass windows, became an icebox. He and his family huddled in a single room, wrapped in every blanket they owned, feeding the fireplace constantly, yet still shivering. Thomas, in his sturdy farmhouse, fought a desperate battle. He had banked the walls with snow and hung quilts over the windows, but the cold was relentless. It found every tiny crack, every weakness. His well pump froze solid. His prize bull, which he had kept in the warmest part of the barn, succumbed on the second night of the freeze. He was exhausted, cold to the bone, and filled with a growing dread. On the third day, a terrible thought struck him. Ilara. No one could survive this on the bluff. Not in that flimsy log sieve of a cabin. And with those damned stone walls she had built, she would have been the first to perish. The cold would have sunk into those rocks and turned her home into a crypt. A wave of guilt washed over him. He had pitied her, yes, but he had also left her to her madness. He should have forced her to leave, dragged her out if he had to. Now she was almost certainly dead. The thought was unbearable. Driven by a grim sense of duty, he bundled himself in every layer of clothing he possessed and set out for her cabin. The journey was a nightmare. The snow was crisp and granular underfoot, squeaking with the intensity of the cold. The air was so frigid it hurt to breathe, searing his lungs. Every exposed bit of skin felt like it was being burned. It took him nearly 2 hours to cover the mile to her bluff, his beard a solid mass of ice, his movements slow and clumsy. He expected to see a dead cabin, a chimney with no smoke, a place already claimed by the absolute cold. But as he crested the final rise, he saw it. A thin, steady plume of smoke rising from her stovepipe, climbing straight up into the still, merciless air. It made no sense. How could she possibly still have a fire? Had she been burning her own furniture? He stumbled to the door, his mind reeling. He was half frozen, his fingers and toes numb and aching. He raised a stiff, mittened hand and knocked, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. There was a pause, then the sound of the bar being lifted from inside. The heavy door swung inward. It was not a blast of frigid air that met him. It was a soft, gentle wave of warmth. It was the most shocking, most welcome sensation he had ever felt. It washed over his frozen face, melting the ice in his beard, seeping into his clothes. He stared, dumbfounded. Alara stood there, dressed not in heavy furs, but in a simple wool dress. Her face was calm. Behind her, the cabin was bathed in the soft glow of her lamp. It looked comfortable, cozy. "Thomas," she said, her voice even, "you look frozen. Come in." He staggered inside, and she pushed the heavy door shut, sealing them in. The stillness was absolute. The killing cold was gone, replaced by a steady, radiant warmth that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. He pulled off his mittens and held his hands out, but not toward the stove, which held only a bed of glowing embers. He held them out toward the nearest stone wall. It was warm. He touched it. The stone was not just free of chill. It was actively radiating heat, a gentle, persistent energy that filled the entire space. He looked around the small room at the solid, dark walls, and finally he understood. He saw the path of the stovepipe, the logic of the thermal mass. It was not madness. It was genius. He sank onto a small stool, overwhelmed by the warmth and by the sheer, stunning fact of his own ignorance. He looked at Alara, at this quiet woman the entire valley had dismissed as a fool, and he felt a profound sense of awe. "How?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. It was the only word he could manage. It was a question, an admission, and an apology all in one. "The stone remembers the fire," she said simply, handing him a mug of hot tea. "Just like it remembers the sun." He stayed for 2 hours, soaking in the life-giving warmth, the feeling slowly returning to his extremities. He told her about his bull, about the desperation in the town. She listened without a word of judgment, without a hint of triumph. When he was ready to leave, she gave him a bundle of hot stones wrapped in cloth to put inside his coat, a small portable piece of her wisdom to help him on his journey home. As he stood in the doorway, ready to face the brutal cold again, he turned to her one last time. "I'll be damned, Alara," he said, shaking his head in wonder. "We all thought you were the foolish one." He didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew who the fools had been. When the white silence finally broke, lifting from the valley like a departing ghost, the full scope of the devastation became clear. Dozens of livestock had been lost. Several outlying homesteads had been abandoned, their owners seeking refuge in town. Old Man Hemlock, who lived alone in a cabin by the creek, was found frozen in his chair. The valley was wounded, its confidence shaken. And in the middle of this shared trauma, the story of Thomas's visit to the widow's perch began to spread. At first it was met with disbelief, but Thomas was a man of unimpeachable honesty. He told the story without embellishment, his voice filled with a convert's zeal. He described the gentle, steady warmth, the quiet comfort, the simple, brilliant logic of the stone walls. The tale was so outlandish, so contrary to everything they knew, that it had to be true. The community's perception of Alara shifted with the force of a tectonic plate. The whispers of madwoman and fool died out, replaced by murmurs of clever and wise. The name Liam's Folly was retired forever. People now referred to her home simply as the Stone Cabin, a name spoken with a new and profound respect. Silas Croft was the last to believe it. He dismissed it as an exaggeration, a fevered dream of a half-frozen man. But when 3 other farmers, whose barns had been decimated, made the trek up the bluff to see for themselves, and returned with the same story of wonder, his certainty began to crack. His own losses had been significant. The cold had ruined a large stock of improperly stored lumber, and killed 2 of his draft horses. His authority, built on a foundation of practical monetary success, had been challenged by a force he couldn't comprehend, a penniless widow with a pile of rocks. The first visitor who came not for refuge but for knowledge was Thomas. He arrived with a notebook and a piece of charcoal, and a humility that sat strangely on his broad shoulders. "Teach me," he said. "I want to do this to my northern wall before next winter." Alara, without hesitation, explained the process: the air gap, the path of the flue, the composition of the mortar. He listened like a schoolboy, scribbling notes, his skepticism replaced by a student's focus. Others followed. They came in ones and twos, men who had openly mocked her now standing at her door, hats in hand, asking for her advice. She shared her knowledge freely. She became not the stone witch, a figure of fear, but the stone woman, a source of a new essential wisdom. She had not sought their approval, and its arrival did not change her. She remained quiet, self-possessed, her strength drawn not from their admiration, but from the solid, warm walls she had built with her own 2 hands. Years passed. The stone cabin became a landmark, a testament to an idea that had saved a woman and taught a valley a new way to think about survival. The Alara method, as it came to be known, was slowly adopted. New homes were built with a stone-lined wall, and old ones were retrofitted. The harsh winters still came, but they were no longer met with the same degree of fear. The memory of the white silence served as a permanent reminder of their folly and of her wisdom. Alara lived out her days on the bluff, in the steady, quiet warmth of her home. She never remarried, finding a companionship in the solid presence of her creation that no person could match. She became the valley's quiet sage, a woman who had listened to the whisper of the earth when everyone else was shouting their own certitudes. Decades later, long after she was gone, a child sitting by the hearth of his family's home, a home with one great warm stone wall, might ask his grandfather why their house was built that way, and the old man, who as a boy had heard the stories firsthand, would look at the stones glowing in the firelight and tell the legend of the stone woman. He would tell of how she was left with nothing but a worthless cabin and a mountain of grief, how the entire valley had laughed at her as she hauled rocks from the river, and how, during the coldest winter in living memory, her foolishness had become a wisdom that warmed them all. The lesson, passed down through generations, was as simple and profound as one of her river stones: that the greatest strength is often hidden in what is dismissed as worthless, and the most enduring warmth comes from the courage to build a life from the things that everyone else has thrown away.